For decades, Jamaica's economy has been closely tied to the International Monetary Fund, better known as the IMF. This is the global financial institution that steps in when countries face deep economic problems. It offers loans, financial backup, and policy advice. But in exchange, governments must agree to follow strict rules on how money is spent, how budgets are managed, and how reforms are carried out. Jamaica entered many of these IMF programs over the years. The relationship stretched from the late 20th century right up until 2025. For a long time, IMF conditions defined what the government could and could not do. But now, that period has ended. In February 2025, the most recent IMF arrangements expired. For the first time in many years, Jamaica is no longer under IMF conditions. The country has stepped into a new stage where the decisions about its budget and its future rest more directly in Kingston rather than Washington. To understand the importance of this change, we need to look at the full story. We need to know why Jamaica turned to the IMF in the first place, how life under IMF programs worked, what the final arrangements were, and what has changed now that they are complete. We also need to understand Jamaica's debt, how it is being managed, how reclassification could affect the country's financial standing, and what the end of IMF oversight means for everyday Jamaicans. Jamaica's reliance on the IMF began during a time of severe economic strain. By the late 1970s and 1980s, the country was already in trouble. Growth was weak, government spending outpaced revenue, and debt piled up. The Jamaican dollar was under pressure. Foreign reserves were scarce, and investors worried about whether the government could meet its obligations. These pressures deepened over the years. By the 1990s and early 2000s, Jamaica's debt-to-GDP ratio was among the highest in the world. This meant that the government owed far more than the size of the entire economy in a single year. Debt service costs dominated the national budget. At times, more money was spent on interest payments to creditors than on healthcare, education, or roads. The burden squeezed out resources for development and left little space for growth. Investors were hesitant to lend to Jamaica directly because of the risk, so the IMF became the key partner that could step in to stabilize the situation. The IMF's support was not free. Every program came with a detailed set of conditions. The Jamaican government had to run very large budget surpluses before paying interest. This meant collecting more in taxes than it spent year after year. Few countries in the world have ever maintained such consistently high primary surpluses. It placed enormous pressure on households and businesses because meeting these targets required either higher taxes or reduced government spending in areas people relied on. Budgets were reviewed regularly by IMF staff. Missions would travel to Kingston, meet with officials, and examine every major decision. If Jamaica met the conditions, money was dispersed, and international investors gained confidence. If the target slipped, support could be delayed or suspended. This is what people mean when they say Jamaica was under IMF control. It does not mean the IMF dictated every single decision day to day. But it does mean that the most important choices about spending, debt, and reforms had to align with IMF requirements. Otherwise, the risk of losing access to funds and facing higher borrowing costs became real. The cycle of programs stretched across decades. Some were short-lived, others ran longer, but all had the same underlying goal: restore stability and credibility in Jamaica's finances. The IMF was both a lifeline and a restraint. It kept the country afloat in times of crisis, but it also forced Jamaica to sacrifice growth opportunities in order to meet strict targets. By the time the 2010s arrived, Jamaica was still carrying one of the heaviest debt burdens in the world. Debt to GDP was above 140%. This meant Jamaica owed more than 1.5 times the size of its entire economy in a single year. Through reforms, restructuring, and continued IMF-backed discipline, the country gradually brought that number down. Progress was slow, but it was steady. Debt fell from unsustainable levels towards something closer to manageable, although it still remained high by global standards. The most recent stage of IMF involvement began in 2023. Jamaica secured access to two key programs. One was called the Precautionary and Liquidity Line. The other was the Resilience and Sustainability Facility. These arrangements were not designed as emergency bailouts, but as safeguards. The idea was to give Jamaica financial backup if conditions worsened, while also supporting reforms that would strengthen long-term resilience. They were important steps in showing that Jamaica was no longer in deep crisis, but rather on the path of stability. Both programs were temporary, lasting 2 years. They expired in February 2025. With their expiration, the IMF confirmed that the arrangements were complete and that Jamaica was no longer subject to their conditions. That means the strict rules and oversight that once defined the country's budgets are now gone. The change carries major implications. First, the Jamaican government now has more policy freedom. For many years, it was forced to run very large primary surpluses. This left little room for new investment in infrastructure, schools, or social programs. With IMF conditions lifted, the government has more flexibility to choose a fiscal path that balances debt repayment with the need to stimulate growth. Second, the way national budgets are debated will be different. In the past, every new budget had to be measured against IMF targets. Ministers had to explain how each decision fit within the framework approved by the IMF. Now, the conversation shifts to Jamaica's own goals. Of course, the government still needs to act responsibly because international investors continue to watch closely. But the immediate presence of IMF oversight is no longer shaping every choice. Third, Jamaica gains credibility for having successfully completed its program. Ending an IMF program on schedule shows discipline and reform. It signals to private lenders that the country can manage its finances without external enforcement. This can encourage better credit terms, lower borrowing costs, and wider access to capital. Debt remains the key challenge. Years ago, Jamaica's debt-to-GDP ratio was more than 140%. Today, it's closer to 72%. That represents real progress. But even at 72%, the debt burden is still heavy. Servicing this debt consumes a large share of the budget. It limits how much can be spent on development, even as IMF rules falls waning. This is where the concept of debt reclassification comes in. Reclassification doesn't erase debt, but it changes how it is counted and reported. Some obligations may be shifted from external to domestic categories. Others may be restructured from short-term to long-term. These changes can make Jamaica's financial position appear more stable and predictable. If investors believe the debt is less risky, Jamaica's credit rating can improve. Better ratings mean the country can borrow at lower interest rates. Lower interest costs free up resources in the budget. Savings that once went to creditors could instead go to education, healthcare, or infrastructure projects. This is not an overnight solution, and the debt will not disappear. But even small reductions in interest costs can create meaningful space for investment in the country's future. It is important to recognize, however, that debt service will remain a large expense for many years. Even with lower rates and reclassification, Jamaica will not suddenly have unlimited funds to spend. Careful management remains essential. The difference is that, without IMF oversight, the government has more freedom in deciding how to strike that balance.